Welcome to Whiskey Lore. I'm Drew Hanisch. Well, if anything could be said about Season 4, it's that it's really just taken on a life of its own. Because I was going to do an episode about George Washington, and an episode about James Anderson, and one about the juke joints, and all of a sudden now I'm into waiting for episode 10 and what I'm going to do with episode 10. And episode 10 is going to be a really interesting one, but it's one that I'm going to have to do some travel to create. So I'm going to be taking a few weeks off because I am heading out on a major road trip to Los Angeles and then to some other spots in between that are going to be great locations for me to pick up more stories around the Old West and whiskey. And then I'm going to come back through Kentucky and then back here to South Carolina. So with all of this travel going on, it's going to be a while before I'm going to be in front of the microphone and have an opportunity to produce the episodes. But before I take this time off, I have 2 episodes that I want to bring you that are interviews. And this first interview I did back in November when I was in Kentucky, and I had a chance to talk with Royce Neeley of Neeley Family Distillery. And Royce has a very interesting story, and you learn it as soon as you walk in the distillery. There is a video that you watch that, as some people warned me before I went, it gets a little graphic in there in some spots. It really goes back into moonshining history and some of the battles that were going on in eastern Kentucky. So you get a real sense of what life was like back in the mountains, not only during Prohibition, but before Prohibition, because most of the action in that video takes place around the turn of the century, 1900, 1902, somewhere in that area. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in this episode, because I sat down with Royce at the distillery and talked to him about his distilling processes, which are very interesting. Some of those come from his 11 generations of passed down distilling history, and other parts come from just the way he wants to create his whiskeys. And he does moonshine, and they're actually opening up a new distillery in eastern Kentucky near where the family had a lot of its moonshining history occur. And so that's going to be an interesting thing to watch that evolve. And then he's got his main distillery right now, which is halfway between Cincinnati and Louisville, and a great place for you to check out if you are going to do a Kentucky bourbon trip this year or next year, whatever you're planning out. I know a lot of people are putting those plans together right now. And if you've read my book, Whiskey Lore's Travel Guide to Experiencing Kentucky Bourbon, then you know I like for you to experience a wide range of distilleries. If you only have 2 or 3 distilleries to go to during your entire trip, don't just go to Beam, Heaven Hill, and Buffalo Trace, or Four Roses, or Wild Turkey. Don't just go to the brands you know, but go to at least one distillery that you don't know about, because you'll bump into some really interesting surprises. And that's part of what I did in my book. Was I wanted to feature 32 distilleries and give you an idea of what each of them focused on, so that you could choose from some of those smaller distilleries and really mix and match and come up with a really great itinerary for your travels. So Neely is one of those distilleries that I say, you really should look at putting these guys on your agenda, because not only do they have the history, you walk into the place and it's like you're walking into a history museum with all of the different trinkets and the stories that they're telling in there, the newspaper articles, all of that. And then their processes are very interesting. They do a sweet match process, which there's only a couple distilleries doing that in Kentucky right now. They have Cypress fermenters and the steel fermenters as well. So it's like, best of both worlds. And this is where I decided in my interview, I wanted to discuss some of these things, what some of his strategies were in putting together this distillery, and why he went with the sweet mash process, why they went with triple pot distilling, and some of the other things that they are doing that are such unique processes. in the way of distilling whiskey. We say unique, but a lot of these are really going back to his moonshine roots. So we're going to talk about a lot of that stuff coming up here in the episode. And by the way, if you are planning that trip and you want to get a copy of Whiskey Lore's Travel Guide to Experiencing Kentucky Bourbon, I made the longest title for a book I possibly could, by the way. Have to think about it every time I say it. You just go out to whiskey-lore.com/Kentucky book, and you can get a copy there, or you can get it on Amazon, and it'll ship anywhere in the world. And even if you are thinking about a trip maybe 3 years from now, you're overseas maybe, and you're not sure when you're going to be able to travel to the U.S., it's a great opportunity for you to get to know more about whiskey and bourbon. It gives you a lot of the history as well. So if you're a history fan like me, well, I share a lot of that stuff in there, as well as processes and the rest. So whiskey-lore.com/Kentucky book, or out on Amazon, and you can get a copy of that. And we're going to start off this conversation talking about history, because when you have 11 generations of whiskey history in your family, there's a lot to discuss. And a lot of this stuff has been passed down through the generations. So the earlier years, there's not a lot of great detail to it, but that's the same with whiskey overall. And their family history goes all the way back into the 1740s with James Neely, one of Royce's ancestors. And so that's where we're going to start our discussion, is by talking a little bit about the history of the Neely family and going back to James Neely and learning more about the origins of the Neely family distilling heritage.
He had come over from a place called Tyrone, Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
It's in Northern Ireland. It is pretty popular for illicit distilling. It was an area that was known for illicit distilling. We're not sure if he was run out of there or if he left willingly.
Okay.
We're also not positive about like what his wealth situation was like at the time. We know that his son and his grandson, so that would be my 10th and 9th generation, were pretty wealthy guys up in Pennsylvania. So we're not sure if he brought some of that with him, mm-hmm. or if they made that when they got over here. They also fought in the Revolutionary War together.
Okay.
So they could have got land based off of their service as well. The main story that's passed down from James is that he had brought his copper pot still with him on the ship when he came over. Now, this is something that my grandfather was very proud of. Mm-hmm. Like I said, I have nothing to prove that. That is literally just a story that's passed down.
Right.
But it was that he had brought the family brought their stills with them when they come over from Ireland. The family had come over and they settled in Pennsylvania. Now, I don't know a ton about what was going on there at the time. We do know that both Robert Neely and David Marion Neely, I'm named after both of them. So my name is Robert David Royce. Okay. They were both in Pennsylvania, and they both had small farm distilleries. So at the time, you could get a license to have a small farm distillery. They were paying a tax on it and making whiskey. And it was at a spot, there's actually a Neely mill up in Pennsylvania. It's right beside where the it's right along where Washington crossed the Delaware at.
Okay.
And the rumor is that he stayed at what's called the Neely House. You can still go see it up there now. It didn't belong to Robert or David Marion, but it belonged to Robert's brother.
Okay.
And that's kind of cool.
Yeah,
so
yeah,
that another thing passed down through the family is that George Washington, the night before they crossed the Delaware, he stayed with the Neelys.
Very nice.
So that's kind of a cool thing. You can still go see the mill. So yeah. It's actually still operational. And it's called the Neely something mill. And still today. And then there's a Neely house over there that you can look at as well.
Oh, that's great.
So that's pretty neat.
You've been up there?
I have not.
Oh, okay.
I've never been up there. Just seen the photos and stuff like that. I'm going to go up there, but I've not been up there. So it'd actually be a cool spot to go catch some yeast at. So, just speculation tells me that they were probably making their whiskey up there with rye. Most guys were. But it was actually after David Marion Neely that the family moved south to Virginia. So that was William Elijah, which would be my 8th great-grandfather.
Okay.
At that time is when the family stopped paying taxes, and there was no more small farm distillery licenses or anything like that. So when they're in Virginia, they moved to Scott County. Mm-hmm. Pretty wide network of Neelys that are still down there, descendants of them. At that time, they were still farming. They were running quite a bit of whiskey. Like I said, that was all on the illegal side. That's when we start to hear some of the stories become more in depth. So then you get to my 7th great-grandfather, which is Joseph Neely.
Okay.
So Joseph is the one that actually moves the family into Kentucky, and he does that in around 1840.
Okay.
We don't know exactly why he moved in there, moved them to Kentucky. Kind of speculation through the family was that there was a lot of taxes trying to be imposed in Virginia and things like that at the time. So a lot of people were moving into Kentucky.
Yeah. Okay.
A lot of settlers were, especially of Scots-Irish descent. So my family did the same thing. They moved into the mountains, kind of like the Wild West at the time there. Really no law, no regulations, no anything going on. And the family's been there ever since.
Okay.
So Joseph, when the Civil War breaks out, he moves the family, or his part of the family goes back to Virginia, and he fights with his relatives in the that'd be the Army of Northern Virginia under Robert E. Lee.
Okay.
His son Armin, which is my great-great-great-grandfather, stays up in Kentucky and fights for the North. So father son fought against each other.
Wow.
So we were story passed down. My great-grandfather met Armin, knew him pretty well, and he told my dad and then that Armin would brag about the fact that he would make whiskey for his soldiers. He was an officer for the cavalry, 14th Kentucky Cavalry, and they would make whiskey for his soldiers at camp. And they were actually responsible. At a time, Morgan's raiders were raiding a lot. There was a lot of people raiding through eastern Kentucky. Armin's unit was a home guard, and he was actually responsible for burning Clay's Ferry to the ground.
Oh, wow.
So the Union burned Clay's Ferry to the ground to keep Confederate raiders from crossing over to raid eastern Kentucky. Mm. And that's kind of cool. So the two things that he bragged about, they had burned Clay's Ferry to the ground, and he made whiskey for his soldiers when they were encamped, which is a pretty neat thing. I have to imagine, we know he was a very tough man, but I have to imagine he was, he was an officer at the age of 18 for the Union. That's not that wasn't a normal thing.
Yeah.
Running grown men through the mountains in eastern Kentucky. What they did was they hunted down Confederate raiders and killed them.
It's so fascinating as you talk about the family, just one generation fighting on two different sides. But Kentucky had an interesting situation that they were sitting there right as a border state. So the whole state was really dealing with that. Yeah,
there's still a chimney left down in Neely Fork where that's Joseph's first home that he had built before he left and went back. All that's left of it's a rock chimney. It's still there on the family property. But yeah, you're talking father, son fighting against each other. So it's kind of weird for me. I've had one great-grandfather that fought for the South and one of my great-grandfathers that fought for the North. So kind of funny in the same line. Yeah. It's not but that was more common in Kentucky. Now Armin was around. He was the patriarch of the family through the entire moonshine feud that starts occurring in 1890. So my great-grandfather alive for all of this. That's when really a lot of our history starts getting more in depth. That's where all the articles are saved at. Everything kind of before that, we have found the licenses for the small farm distilleries that they had up in Pennsylvania. But besides that, everything else through the family was hearsay until we start getting to around 1890. So my great-grandfather was born in 1890. At the time, there's another family in eastern Kentucky, the Allens. And these guys went back and forth, the Neelys and the Allens went back and forth with each other for about 10 years over moonshine territory. Kind of funny because at the similar time, there's another two families, which is the Hatfields and McCoys, 2 counties over, that are also going back and forth with each other over moonshine territory. And there's a lot of these stories. I mean, when you get down there in the mountains, you hear a lot of, there was a lot of feuding that was going on. Isolated area, not much money down there, and times were tough. So at the time, you really only had coal mining and bootlegging. It was really one of the only two ways to make money.
When you're talking about territory, too, did they have particular people that they were selling to, certain clientele they were selling to? They weren't selling to shops,
right?
That kind of thing.
And there's not any shops. So in eastern Kentucky, and this goes all the way up through Prohibition and definitely after Prohibition, because all of eastern Kentucky stayed dry.
Okay.
The country went wet. Eastern Kentucky stayed dry. There was no liquor stores. So in eastern Kentucky at this time, you have bootleggers, and they're like an illegal liquor store, and you might have 10 of them on one street. And this is where people hung out at. This is where you went to get your booze and things like that. There wasn't a market or a liquor store or anything, a bar. And one moonshiner could supply X amount of bootleggers. So just like today, our distillery supplies all these different types of retail outlets.
Right.
Still the same thing. Difference is they wanted to make sure that nobody else was selling to those bootleggers as well. That was their areas where they sold to, and if you were drinking in that area, you drank Neely moonshine or you drank Allen moonshine.
Okay.
And they fought over those type of areas.
Yeah. So this all escalated around 1902.
It did. So they say like the Hatfield and McCoy feud come to a boil over a pig when it initially happened. Ours come to a boil actually over a woman. So James Neely and John Allen, there's probably 30 different news articles on this. It made national news. Says they were affectionate over the same woman. Mm-hmm. They got into an argument at what was called a bean stringing or a candy pulling. It was a community event. It actually happened on Neely Fork.
Okay.
So it was on the Neely territory, and in the middle of the argument that they were having, my great-great-grandfather, Jess Neely, takes the pistol that we still have, and he shoots John Allen 6 times in the chest with it and kills him on the spot. John actually falls to the ground and rolls up under the porch, and he dies up under the porch. And we have pretty much direct accounts of people that were still there that my dad and definitely my grandfather were able to talk to that witnessed the entire thing happen, which is pretty neat. So after that happens, Jess Neely turns around and he punches Robert Allen and knocks him onto the ground. So definitely shot him out of passion because he emptied the entire magazine of his Colt 1900 into John Allen. So he had no more ammunition.
Yeah.
So he then jumps up onto his horse to grab his rifle, and when he does, Robert Allen, laying on his back, pulls his pistol out, shoots him in the back of the head, and kills him. At that time, both sides started firing. So we've got one news article over here, actually out of Chicago, that said there was 55 shots fired, 8 of them injured, and 2 of them killed by the time they got them both separated.
Wow.
So as Robert Allen is escaping, this would be my great-great-uncle, James Neely, Jess's brother, actually tries to tackle him to the ground, and Robert shoots him in the arm with a 10-gauge shotgun and almost blows his arm off. I've got a photo of him up there on the top left. That's James. You can see his dead arm hanging.
Oh, man.
So after Jess Neely dies, Armin's an old man at this point. Kind of cool, though, the pistol that we have. Armin would have touched it as well. So this is happening in 1902. Armin didn't die until 1911.
Okay.
And the gun itself is a very interesting piece, not only because of the fact that 6 generations of my family have held it, that it killed rival moonshine family members and things like that, but just the gun. If you know anything about firearms, the 1911 is a very classic firearm designed by John Browning, right? But on the way up to designing that, he made a bunch of different prototypes. The Colt 1900 was the initial prototype to the 1911. How my great-great-grandfather got a hold of that gun, we've got the Colt documents on it. It was shipped into Louisville, Kentucky in 1900.
Okay.
And the Colt only tracks it to where it goes, so somehow it went from Louisville, Kentucky to the mountains of eastern Kentucky into his possession. But, I mean, that today would have been, this is a time when most guys down there are using black powder pistols. This thing holds 8 rounds into it. It's semi-automatic. Nobody's ever seen one of these before. That would have been a heck of a piece to have. So the whole family would have definitely looked at it, held it, shot it. It would have been a revered gun to have had. There's not very many of them floating around down there at the time.
Yeah.
He had a decent amount of money, Jess Neely did.
Okay. Moonshining was
right.
a lucrative trade.
It was. Very dangerous, but lucrative.
Yeah.
Just like most illegal things. Most guys, I wouldn't call them gangsters, but they're essentially gangster-esque. That's just kind of the industry that they were in.
I think we get a lot of our images of moonshine from the time period of Prohibition, but going back to this earlier time, was the law really that intense on going after moonshiners, or was it just kind of they were probably related and they just let them go do what they're going to do?
At the time, alcohol tax is a huge deal in the United States. 1890, 1900. And you're right, a lot of people think of moonshine and Prohibition, and then after Prohibition with guys in the 50s running running hot rods and stuff through the mountains. And all that stuff definitely happened, don't get me wrong. But moonshining was a huge part of American history all the way definitely from the Civil War all the way up until Prohibition as well, especially in the American South where the mountains themselves are set up for making whiskey. And the reason why is, so you have a bunch of different farmers, right? But your grain will not hold through the winter. So if you grow all of your grain and you have excess amounts of it, you can't store that through the winter, it'll destroy. But you can take it to your your local distiller, have it liquefied into whiskey, and it'll keep year round, and you have something to take to trade and to barter with.
Right.
Whiskey at this time is not only used for drinking to get drunk for social purposes, but used for a lot of medicinal purposes as well. At the time you don't have medicine and you don't have pharmacies and things like that in the mountains, so they were making cough syrups with whiskey. They were using it to sanitize wounds with. They were putting it in water. Sometimes it was safer to drink whiskey than it was to drink water, which could be contaminated from a well. Mm-hmm. So a lot of different reasons for trade on whiskey. After the Civil War, another reason why my family moved to the South and then moved into the mountains of eastern Kentucky, after the Civil War, they imposed a tax on whiskey again. We had this problem right after the country was founded, when Washington started the alcohol excise tax to pay for the Revolutionary War, which started a whiskey rebellion up in Pennsylvania. That's about the time my family leaves as well and moves further south. Kind of cool. They follow that same line that a lot of Scots-Irish did. Yeah. They left up there in whiskey rebellion, and then around the Civil War, when they were starting to gear up and tax and pursue it a lot more then as well, they moved into the mountains, into eastern Kentucky. So your question of, what was it like with law enforcement officers and things at the time, they were definitely pursuing it because we didn't have income tax then in the United States. Okay. So the majority of revenue that the country was using to do all the different things that the country does was off of alcohol tax. Right. So locally, you didn't have, a lot of judges were paid off. A lot of judges were in on it, almost like the marijuana trade today in eastern Kentucky. A lot of judges and politicians were in on it. You didn't have that much of a problem there as much as you did with the excise tax men that would come down. And, these guys, my grandfather remembers them tarring and feathering a tax man in Clay County. Wow. And you're talking about in the 50s.
Yeah. Holy cow.
They tarred and feathered one. So, but they did come down there. Kentucky and eastern Tennessee definitely, and the mountains in North Carolina, definitely places where you could hide out at and not have to deal with the excise tax man. Yeah. But if you were, moonshining up in Pennsylvania, it was a major problem, 1880s, 1890s, 1900, them coming after you for wanting their tax money.
Yeah. I hear a lot of stories about caves, and that a lot of distillers would go and hide out had a cave where they do their distilling, right, mostly because couldn't be spotted, but you're also probably getting a water source nearby as well. Is that kind of what you heard?
Yeah, and you're protected from the elements. It's also, you don't want to be having an open fire and it start raining on you. Yeah. The mountains themselves are set up perfect for making whiskey. The reason why natural springs are there, so the water's good and clean, for one. But number two is those natural springs very cold. Mm-hmm. And you can set your still up below one and gravity feed the water from the spring down to the worm and into the pot. And it took a lot of the labor off of it. Okay. So the mountains, not only because of the fact that they're so isolated, but the water itself and the environment, the terroir, is perfect for making whiskey. And they have natural yeast strands that are present there. We still use one that our family, a lot of people don't understand this. They didn't just go buy Fleischmann's or baker's yeast or stuff like that back then. Yeast wasn't even discovered till I think 1870 by Louis Pasteur. Before that, all whiskey was being made with wild yeast that you caught and either propagated in a Donna jug, or most of the time they just knew that there was seasons where you made whiskey at when it was warmer out, and you take your mash and let it sit outside, and the wild yeast, the natural yeast, gets inside of it and works it.
Okay, and you're bringing a lot of those techniques into here.
Yeah, I'm still probably one of the only distilleries in the United States, in Kentucky, that still propagates and grows a yeast strand on site. And it's the same one. We go catch it once a year down in the mountains out of Neely Fork, bring it up here. I keep it in a copper Donna jug year round, and we work off of that. We use it to make our moonshines with, and now we're starting to make a bourbon with it as well, which is kind of neat. I'll let you try it when we get done here.
Nice.
And I got the white dog back there. First time we ever run it. But we've actually got this room over here to your left is actually going to be a Donna room. And Dick Stoll, who was the last master distiller for the Real Mictors that closed in 1991 in Pennsylvania, a good friend and mentor of mine, actually designed this yeast room for me. Oh, okay. So he was taught how to grow yeast from Charles Everett Beam, and who was the distiller at the time. It was called Baumberger's. It became Mictors. He was the distiller there until he died of a heart attack. And he was from the Beam family. Okay. And he's the one that taught Dick Stoll, and Dick Stoll taught me, so that's kind of a pretty cool thing.
Oh, very nice.
Yep. So I'm able to, to not have to rely on anybody else to make yeast for me, which to me is, if you ever want to be a real distiller, you need to be able to work and grow your own yeast.
Yeah. Well, and you also have an interesting setup in that you're one of only two distilleries I've been to, Lefroy in Scotland being the other, that uses both Cypress fermenters And, well, actually, I take that back. They used Cypress fermenters, and they've moved over to stainless steel now. You have both.
I do.
Cypress and stainless steel. So what's your philosophy behind that, and what do you see as the difference? Because it's always one of the things that I question on tours is, why do you use the wooden fermenters versus using the stainless steel?
So the reason why I use the wooden fermenters is because my great-grandfather used wooden fermenters as well. So he fermented in wood barrels.
Okay.
That's the reason why I started using them. If you go back through history, almost every distillery at one time used Cypress. There's arguments based off of whether or not it affects flavor or not. I can tell you firsthand, it absolutely does. So what is made in the stainless versus what's made in the Cypress? A lot of people say that our products have a type of what they call Neely funk to them. I hope that's a good funk. But they say we have this unique profile that spans every single one of our products.
Yeah.
Well, the unanimous thing amongst all of our products is the fact that they're fermented in that open top Cypress.
Okay.
So what you're getting from that Cypress is you'll see our bay doors are open. We're inviting the wild yeast in the area where we're at into our distillery, and it gets inside of there and works in that mash year round, right? But in the wintertime, this wild yeast is going to go dormant. Below 55 degrees, yeast goes dormant for the rest of the year. That's why there is a distilling, old school moonshining season. You couldn't moonshine in the winter unless you moved inside where it's warm and brought a yeast strand with you in there.
Okay.
So for us, that's where the Cypress comes into play. The smaller yeast itself is about 2 microns in length, can get inside of the pores of that Cypress, deep in there to where steam can't ever get to them, and it lives in that Cypress year round, creating its own miniature microbiome inside of each one of those fermenters. The fatter bacteria, surface bacteria, can't get through those pores, and we're able to steam and kill those off. So that gives our product the same taste even in the wintertime as the summertime as well, when that yeast is dormant, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
If you go and look at my stainless fermenters back there, they're actually surrounded by the Cypress. And the reason why is that the yeast will move from that Cypress into that stainless as well.
Oh.
It's attracted to wherever the most sugar is.
Yeah.
So it'll spore and move over there. That's one way we help to inoculate those as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. And then you also do the sweet mash
I do.
process. And it's my understanding that the sweet mash process, where you're not adding back in old sour mash from the previous batch in, can sometimes be more challenging because your bacteria can get out of control or could potentially ruin a batch. How does the Cypress also kind of assist in that in any way, or and why did you go with sweet mash?
Yeah,
what was your purpose?
And let's remember here that all aspects of the distillery work in together to create a product. A lot of people ask, like, what's the one thing you do that makes your product taste the way that it does? Well, it's not the one thing. It's all different aspects of what we do. And Jim Rutledge would be the first one to tell you've got to be right at every single point. If you mess up any part of the steps, the whiskey itself is going to come out bad. So when it comes to my decision on whether or not to sweet mash or sour mash, so sweet mash come before sour mash. In order to get a sour mash, you must sweet mash first.
Okay.
Right, to get the back set or the spent stillage to reuse over and over again. So I chose sweet mash, and this is one differentiation from my family. My family sour mashed.
Okay.
If you're making whiskey in the woods, you almost have to, because the environment itself, so much bacteria, it's uncontrollable, and you need that sour mash to be able to lower the pH level down enough to keep the bacteria out of that mash.
Okay.
The other big thing when you're making whiskey legally in the woods is they don't have access to live steam like I do here at my distillery. So what my great grandfather would do is he would take his sour mash straight off of the pot, it's boiling hot, and he would direct that flow onto the side of his wood vats, and that boiling hot mash would kill anything that was on them.
Okay.
So he used it as a way to sanitize as well.
Yeah.
So it's more efficient because you're adding heat back in. That the BTUs on that heat you're getting to reuse. You're lowering the pH level from around a sweet mash of 6 down to 4.8 to 5.2 for a sour mash. It makes the mash itself less susceptible to bacteria wanting to get in it. And you're using it to sanitize the outside of those vats the same way we do with live steam. So those are all the benefits of sour mashing. So the problem with sour mashing is that pH of the sour mash itself is around 3.5. Mm-hmm. So when you put that in on top of the grains, the acidity itself can hurt those grains. So it hurts the flavor of them. It makes things, in my opinion, more bland, more consistently taste like that sour mash does, right? So the acidity itself can harm the integrity of the grain structure. The other thing is the yeast itself does not prefer that acidic environment either. Now, can it tolerate it? Absolutely. And you would rather have it tolerate an acidic environment than you would have the bacteria inside of it. However, it prefers that sweet mash, right?
Okay.
And you got to look at it this way. So you have a pond, okay? Imagine you have a pond. You have fish swimming in. These fish are like yeast. You have the alligators that are trying to get into the fish, right? You could put a poison in there, like sour mash, to keep the alligators out, but what's it do to the environment for the fish?
Right.
And that's what I try to explain to people back there when we're talking about a tour, just the generalized what we're doing for that yeast. So the yeast itself is going to stop working at around a pH of around 4 to 3.5. All right. So by having a pH level instead of 5.2 soured to 6 on a sweet mash, you create more of a buffer for that yeast to survive in. All right.
Okay.
So the longer the yeast can survive in the mash, as long as you're taking care of other aspects, not too much yeast, not too high of a sugar content, no bacteria inside of it, cooling the mash. There's a lot of things you have to do to take care of yeast to make them work the way you want them to. But the longer they can work, the more complex flavors that they can produce.
Okay.
So that's something that we've definitely seen back here as we've extended our fermentation days out to 5 and 6 day fermentations instead of turning in 3 or 4 days. We're giving that yeast longer time. We're controlling our fermentations, and I'm able to steam back here. So this is why I sweet mash instead of sour mash, or how I'm able to do it.
Yeah.
So we've got a Cypress fermenter. We're going to put a tarp over top of it and inject a steam line into the bottom of it. And we're going to steam that for upwards of about 45 minutes, bringing the internal temperature above 160 degrees inside of there, and that's going to kill any type of surface bacteria that's inside of that fermenter. And that's what we want to do. Clean it out very good to make sure we don't have anything left over for secondary fermentations to occur on the next time we ferment. But the other big thing is, you'll notice in my distillery, nothing is hard piped in.
Okay.
All right. So we have flexible hoses and a pump that we're able to move around. So we steam the hoses and that pump as well.
So nothing is trapped inside.
Nothing's trapped inside.
The batch.
That's right. So we sanitize very, very well here, and we have to be able to sweet mash.
Yeah.
We're also going to crash our fermenter down, our cooker down as quickly as we can. So from a point of about 145, less susceptible to bacteria, as it moves on down, it's much more susceptible to mash itself is. We're going to crash that very, very quickly from that 145 down to 90 where we pitch our yeast at, not allowing for very much time for any type of bacteria to get into that mash. Pump it over through a sanitized line and pump into a sanitized fermenter, add our yeast in very quickly, and then we let the yeast go to work to do their thing to keep the bacteria out after that.
Okay.
That's how we're able to effectively sweet mash. Knock on wood, I've never lost a mash in here, which is good. And I've been doing this on the illegal side before we went legal as well. So I had definitely my process down of what I wanted to do, and then all I did was scale it up when we come here to the distillery.
Yeah, you have a little still that's sitting in your visitor center. That's there's a story behind that.
I did.
I
built that when I was 18. It was my first still. It's a 10-gallon all copper. Used to run it when I was in college. We bootleg on the weekends and things like that. But yeah, so same thing I'm making that I made on it is essentially the same process we're doing back here today.
Okay. Did this end? Is this the one that ended up at the University of Kentucky? Because I know there's a little story behind that.
There
also.
is, yes. So I went to Transylvania. That's my alma mater, but I lived on UK's campus. Really, for the simple fact that the girls were hotter over there. So that's where me and my buddies were at. We had a party house over, and we had a still set up in the kitchen on one of those party houses on Columbia Avenue. And we would bootleg while we were studying. We would run whiskey, and then we'd take it to. I played baseball at Transy. We'd bootleg it at baseball parties, bootleg it out at my buddies' frat parties, and we were making quite a bit of money doing it. And one day, my dad and mom got to talking, and they received some phone calls from my landlord about parties we were having down there, and that wasn't going too well. And then they got to asking, well, has Royce asked you for money? No. Does he ask you for money? No. How's he eating down there if we're not giving him any money? They thought I was doing something, I'm sure, much worse than bootlegging. And they showed up, and the still was set up. Mother was not very happy. But that's how I got into it.
Okay.
So I'd heard the stories, like we were talking about, my entire life. And when I got into college and I knew I could make a little bit of extra money doing it, I built and set up my own distilling operation, like I said, in our kitchen.
Yeah.
And, I developed a severe love and passion for it.
Nice.
When I got out of school, I knew this is what I wanted to do. I'm very fortunate that my father and mother both had very successful businesses. My dad owned a construction company for 35 years, and he actually built our entire distillery here. So between him and me, it was kind of the perfect mix, him being able to handle the entire construction side of it, and me being able to set the distillery up and run it the way I wanted it run.
So where did you get your distilling skills from? From your father? Was he distilling it?
Uncle, grandfather, things like that. And then I really, I like to say I'm a student of the industry, but I just picked the brains of a lot of distillers here in Kentucky. And we've got a really unique culture in Kentucky where the distillers themselves, a lot of times, are very willing to share information amongst each other.
Yeah.
So like I said, I learned a great deal just from meeting with Dick Stoll and talking with him. There's no reason for him to have ever told me the things that he did, but it's helped me out a ton and definitely a part of what we do here at the distillery now. And he made a lot of people say the greatest bourbon ever, the Agehurst 16 year and 20 year. That was made by Dick Stoll at Michter's.
Okay. Yeah.
And he actually gave me the mash bill for that we're replicating here as well.
Wow. Yeah. Is that going to be a special release of some form, or
we'll see as we go on with it? But really cool for him to be able to let us come up there and meet with him. We done it he was part of a distillery called Stolen Wolf.
Okay.
And the Wolf family, they've got a lot of history in Pennsylvania. They're great people. But Eric was really nice. Let me come up there and meet with him. And he's a great young distiller. He's about my age as well, distillery owner and distiller.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, Dick passed this past year, which is terrible to hear because we lost one of the greatest distillers that's ever lived. But at least me and Eric were able to get a lot of information out of it. That's right, which is nice. So
that's the real challenge right now, I think, especially for me doing the podcast. Is I had a chance to interview Al Young of Four Roses, and he died a month after the interview. And I had so many other questions I would love to have asked him after that, because Four Roses had such an interesting history. But you start looking around and you're saying, wow, you really got to capture a lot of these stories before they disappear.
And I got to interview Jerry Dalton as well. He's the only non-blood beam master distiller ever. He was between Booker and Fred, he was the missing link. They don't talk about Jerry a lot, but he done a lot for the company. He was big on QC and the things I got to learn from him, which further reified the fact that I don't want piped-in lines. I like flexible lines and just making sure bacterial growth doesn't occur and that stuff. And, I learned a lot of that from Jerry Dalton, and not trying to plug anybody else, but the only reason why I met these guys was through Steve Akeley with the ABV network. So I met my wife through his podcast, The Bourbon Daily. She's a co-host on there.
Okay.
And so, but anyway, so I would go on The Bourbon Daily and he would interview these guys on the Bourbon Show, and he got to where he was like, "Oh, you want to come on the Bourbon Show and help me interview him?" And that's how I met Jerry Dalton, and that's how I met Dick Stowe as well. So I owe a lot of that stuff to Stowe. I would have never met these guys had it not been for him. Which is cool. But we definitely tie in a lot of our family history into our process back there, probably as much as any distillery out there.
Yeah.
We like to use in that open top Cypress. The triple pot distillation, so that's an old Irish technique. It's been passed down through my family. My great uncle Charlie, they say he made the best moonshine down there. That's him over there on the wall there.
Okay.
He's the wiry-looking fellow with no shirt. They say he made the best moonshine down there, and he actually pulled time twice. He was arrested by federal agents for making moonshine, and he triple pot distilled. And
so were they doing this all in the same still, just running it through 3 times?
That's right.
Okay.
Yep. He liked to triple pot distill. He also liked to utilize a thump keg as well.
Okay.
And you see the old family, that's my great-grandfather's original still over there. It's set up just like that.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And I've always triple pot distilled.
Yeah.
And it's always been funny to me. My great-grandfather and grandfather could not read or write. This was not... They didn't go to school in Eastern Kentucky. It wasn't you learned to shoot guns and ride horses and things like that back then, make whiskey than you did go to school. But they knew how to triple pot distill. That tells you how things are passed down from father to son. I've always thought that was neat. Two very uneducated. It wasn't like they learned it by reading or anything like that. It was literally just skills passed down down to me as well. I've always thought that was pretty neat.
Well, a big thank you to Royce Neeley for joining me for this interview and for giving of his time. If you'd like to learn more about Neely Family Distillery, then just go to neelyfamilydistillery.com. And for more of this interview, because there's another 30 minutes worth of it, become a Whiskey Lore Society Patreon member by going to patreon.com/whiskey lore. We talk about triple pot distilling, barrel choices, and a very special moonshine they're coming out with, a first of its kind. And join me next week as I bring an author on board to talk about whiskey history in New York. Until next time, cheers and Slanjava. Whiskey Lore is a production of Travel Fuels Life, LLC. For show notes and transcripts, head to whiskey-lore.com/episodes.